have nothing to go with.
We had the whole.
You don't have nothing to go with?
Plus the.
Oh, I could go out there and show them up, but I know.
Just gonna start over.
All right, good evening, everybody.
Of ours with flower bulbs or something here before. So we gave it back to the school.
Sweet.
Yeah, I called one Sunday afternoon and said, what are y'all doing here? Come on out. I'm your son.
Yeah, he brought the church one night. Well, there he is. There he is.
Well, hi, Jim.
Church one Wednesday night, his truck was full.
I'm just posting the link and then we can get going here.
I mean, it was just all.
Yeah, they were still digging the day we were there at ours.
Preacher, man, do you still want tea?
Oh, sure. I've been
We're gonna
missing
bring
that.
you the whole mixer and you're gonna start making.
Okay, it's fine. Okay.
5 bottles of concentrate.
And I've got a whole bag of bottles for you in my car.
Morning, Titus.
So you keep your dirt really wet,
Oh,
standing on,
yeah.
do you? We do too, but it just doesn't have time
I don't mind not take all of this.
Are we in Titus tonight?
But if it gets dry.
Well, I'm not interfering in Richard's. Since I'm just subbing for Richard tonight. On the corner of your table is the lesson for tonight. I already distributed everything.
Yeah.
do you?
Yeah, that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
anything for
I
a
like
while.
to do something, just don't know that.
And I got plenty of cooking.
All right, just another moment here.
What you gonna do?
On the corner of your tables is the lesson for tonight, so, and the prayer list, so you can grab that. Puts everybody in
Are we only on verse 1?
there. Oh, come on, would it be a Bible study if I did more than one verse? I mean, no.
Yes, say what you been doing.
You know what's funny is when I first wrote this lesson, I did verses 1 through 4, and it was like 7 pages long, and I was like, no, we're just gonna do verse 1. I'm not doing more than that. Okay. Now, normally I don't text out Wednesday night or Tuesday, but since it's our first in-person meeting in nearly 2 months, I'm gonna let the whole church know we're here. So we're excited to be
I
here.
found out we was gonna have tonight through Mr. Peters.
Okay.
I have no way of getting any text.
Well, it's funny, like,
You can call.
right when you called me, I was just about ready to call you because I had just been calling people, so, yeah. In fact, you guys have been ahead of me multiple times. Okay, yep, we're up, we're good. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to our first assembly since everything happened. I'm thankful to report that even though we have a prayer list to go through, I'm not aware of anybody being very ill or hospitalized during these 2 months. And really, that's remarkable. You don't even have to think about the virus for that to be remarkable. I mean, when's the last time we had 2 straight months of no major illness and real hospitalizations in our church family? So,
That's just about the way everything in Macon County around.
Yeah.
You know, if we didn't hear it on the news so much, we wouldn't even know much.
not really. Now, in fact, it's funny you bring that up. Back in 1918, when the Spanish flu was everywhere, Missouri, rural Missouri, this area, was not really aware of the problem until there were nearly 50,000 cases in Missouri alone. That's how, because, you know, information didn't travel fast back then.
See, my mother was involved in that.
Ah,
She's a baby.
okay.
She was a baby.
Yeah.
And her and her mother was, well, that's what they told her, she said, my mom and I was sick. But she always accredited that to being, she never had taken shot, you know, flu vaccine, she never had. She said, I've never been sick with anything like that. My mom will never be. And so maybe she thought maybe it made her immune to it. But she's one of them
Okay.
during the Spanish flu.
Huh. Well,
She's a baby.
no, that's a good story. Well, let's look at our prayer list here. We'll go through the prayer list and have one prayer for all three lists. I went back through this list because again, we haven't had any major illnesses or hospitalizations. There really hasn't been a whole lot of updates. But I went ahead and went through the list again today and got a hold of people and asked how they were doing. And so we'll just go through this here. I talked to Bill and Velda today, and they're okay, just hold up. Of course, Bill tells me he was holed up before this whole thing happened. So not a whole lot different for him, but they're all right. He is healing still from that fall he had when he was still here, if you remember. It's been a slow heal, but it is healing, so that's good news. Let's see.
The Bones family, I was wondering about them.
Well, it hasn't.
Where are they at?
The virus really hasn't hit Haiti hard.
Okay, that's what I was.
Things haven't changed much down there.
But they have had a case of it down there.
Yeah.
haven't they?
They just haven't had an outbreak, which is miraculous when you consider how filthy that place is. But they also think it's possible that, one, it's super hot down there, especially this time of year, and two, because people live in filth, they're pretty immune to things. So they might just be stronger in that regards. So anyway, that's what we know.
Not very many obese people there.
Not very many obese people, and not that many old people.
No, 'cause
No, they don't get over.
They don't live that long. So that may be another reason why.
You know what you talk about them way with the railroad down there, but it's in poor part of town. I've seen little babies running around in the snow, and cause mom and dad don't care, they don't even pay no attention, they're even out. And they may be in diapers, and kids that's 8 and 9 years old, no coats on, raining or something, but they live, those little birds pull through it more if it's somebody else, they
Yeah.
would be sick.
Right.
All of those little ones that they're tough,
Yeah.
of that caliber, I guess.
Right. Well, and good news is the Bunsies are doing all right, so we're grateful for that. Let's see. Tried to get a hold of Charlene and Tom today. They didn't get back to me, but that's okay. I talked to them last week and they were doing fine. Like most people, just kind of staying at home. So, and even though the lockdown's been lifted in Missouri, other than church, I don't know a whole lot that's open.
No, that's what I was getting ready to say. The license bureau is, they're gonna drive through.
Yeah.
I didn't even know they had a window.
I saw the line today. I went to the post office today and had to stand 6 feet apart from
Maybe
people.
They've gotta be on the north side, there's an alley there, that might be.
Well, the window's right up front.
Oh,
Yeah.
On the
Yeah.
sidewalk.
Yeah, on the sidewalk, yeah.
On that west side.
Yep. But then I saw what looked to be a garage sale going on in town.
There was one advertised in the newspaper. I didn't remember what day it was supposed to be.
I just drove past. I'm like, that's none of my business. I mean, in the end, adults will do what adults will do. I'm not gonna
oh, it's,
get
the
involved.
beer, I think, was advertising. I like that, just put it out for free. If you got stuff you want, just put it out, and then you drive, I seen that. I think
That's
it was
fine.
beer.
Yeah, what's fun? Try to get a hold of Dave and Loretta Kelcher. I talked to them last week. If you remember when they were, Dave had applied for a church up in Grissom, Indiana, and it didn't work out, but they were in a car accident the last day they were there, and they've been in recovery ever since. So, yeah, pretty serious stuff. Pretty sad. But they were still on the mend when I talked to them last week. Talked to Donna Mefford today. They're doing fine. They're just going to work and going home. Nothing else going on. Paige, the granddaughter, she's doing pretty good. I actually saw her walking around the neighborhood. I think it was 2 days ago. Sean and Georgette, they are trying to buy a house here in town, or in Macon, and they want to get, because Georgette still has to drive Sean everywhere, and he's years away from getting his license back, they want to live closer to ConAgra. So they're going to try to get a house in town. So that's the plan. That way on nice days he can walk instead of having to always drive in now. And since they've had, 2 car accidents out there, that Highway T is, a lot of accidents happen out there, and they've had 2. And I think they're tired of it.
Where's that
at Excello.
Oh, is that where they live?
Yeah.
We were right, what's the over at it used to.
Oh, right down there.
Yeah, that was Paul Kevin's.
Yeah, Linda Maurer, when she passed away, she left her house to Sean.
Is that
So,
where it's at?
yep. Fred and Carmela, they're in the nursing home. The plan is for them to stay there at this point.
Hey, Lock Haven.
Yes. Yep. And I
She got a birthday.
yeah,
Supposedly,
yeah, yeah, I think she is turning 100. Fred's 102, I think now.
I think he's still 101.
Is he 101?
That's what I understood. I don't know.
But the plan is for them to stay at the nursing home at this point. Carmela's not fighting it as hard as she did last time. So anyway, I tell you, it's really bizarre not being able to visit the nursing homes and the hospitals and people in their homes. That has been so weird for me. So grateful that they're okay, but looking forward to getting back to whatever normal can look like soon. Same with Helen Decker. She's all right, just at Clarence, but of course I haven't been there. Talked to Janet and Leroy today. In fact, what's funny is I called Janet and talked to her, and then I saw Leroy pull into the Ace Hardware parking lot, so he's obviously fine. So it's good. Let's see. Jim and Carol, talked to them last week. They're okay, just hunkered down. Nowhere to go. Larry and Jane Ann, I tried to call them today, didn't get through, but I did talk to them last week, and doing as good as can be expected.
Before this all happened, maybe a week, on a Sunday, I went to visit. I called Nance first.
Sure.
And then I called about a few days later, and they did have a lady that was staying with them.
Yes.
Now, is that still the way it is?
Yeah, they're getting in-home nursing.
No, this lady stays in there.
Oh.
Last night.
You mean Larry and Jane Ann?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was only for a couple weeks when Jane Ann had surgery.
Yeah.
And while she was healing, they had hired a couple of people that spend all the time with them just as
Okay,
emergency.
that's cool. Good deal. Well, Linda, do you have information on Marie that's newer than last week?
Just that she looks good, she's doing well.
Okay.
They opened the window where we can talk to her through the window.
Oh, okay, that's cool.
And I talked to Miriam Farrington the other day, and she's doing good.
Yeah.
Now they're, where she stays down there, they had taken several of them out on a bus ride to kind of see
Oh, okay.
things going on. But, no, they're still locked down too.
Yeah. Yeah, Miriam, she actually called me a week or two ago, and we talked for a while, and yeah, she's doing all right. So, you know what's fun about Miriam is that she still wants me to send her CDs of sermons from the boys and things like that. So she's still involved and keeping track of things. And she feels like she needs to take over from Jane from being the boys' #1 cheerleader. So she does that from a distance. And by the way, our boys are scheduled to preach 3 times in June. So pretty awesome.
I mean, it's church or something.
No, somewhere else.
Oh.
Yeah, which is awesome. So still doing ministry every way we can. Everywhere we're invited, anywhere we can go. They might reopen the jail to visits on the 15th, so I'm looking forward to that if they do it. So haven't been able to go there either. Let's see. Talked to Megan yesterday or today, one of the two. She said she's working at Walsworth, so that's cool.
She
That's
works
great.
7 days a week.
Wow, well, good for her. Sure beats 0. Yeah, she said she was tired. Yeah.
How's Mary Ann?
Mary Ann.
Mary Ann told me about it.
Oh, Mom.
She came home from the nursing home, and she has, people that are there with her all the time, because she can't get up and get down, and, things she needs to do. So she has a total of 4 ladies, there's only one there at a time, of course, but day and night.
Okay.
All right.
Kids are, some of the kids are close, all the kids are close, I guess.
How's Savannah?
She's still good.
Yeah.
She still hopes to get out and get closer to home, in a different setting than what she's in, but we don't hear nothing
Is she still where she was?
in St. Louis.
Okay. Okay. That's good.
They had it pretty bad down there, so,
Right,
not where she's at, but the other
Yeah.
side did, and of course, the town had it all over.
seems to be cities,
Yeah, it does.
yeah,
I heard
really.
some people's moving out to the outskirts now because of that, so it said on the news, and I thought, I hope too many of them do that.
I grew up in a city, and I thought I'd always be a city boy, and boy, am I glad I was wrong about that. And not just about this, just everything,
That's right.
you know, just everything. The moment you have a child, you realize, wow, I want to live rural. Yeah, for sure.
You don't know nothing about it, huh?
In fact, Jonathan, the other day, we were standing in line at Ace Hardware to check out because he was hired by somebody to put some lights in their garage, and he just started singing some country song, and I said, "Son, how am I your father? Like, how did this happen? Like, he's had such a different upbringing than I've had. You know, it was such two different universes. In fact, what's funny is none of my children are really computer competent, which I think is hilarious. Like, they can use a computer, but none of them know how to fix them or anything. And they're always asking me to do this, that, or the other. And I think, how did this happen? You know, I didn't raise a single nerd. I don't know how that occurred. So, yeah. Yeah. Susan, talked to her a couple of times in the past week. She's doing well. They're hopefully going to get they got their RV sold. They're hoping still to get their house sold. But right now, it's really hard to sell anything. So, we'll see.
Who's Susan White?
That is Susan. That's who I just talked about. Susan White is John Cook and Heather Cook's mother. And she comes here when they're not traveling. So, of course, they're not traveling right now. Let's see.
Todd Duncan, I think you could take him off the list.
Oh, yeah?
I
Okay.
saw him over at Extreme Sports the other day, and he got him a side-by-side Ranger and everything, so I think he's good.
I'm penless.
I think
Okay, thanks.
He's recovered,
it's quite a recovery.
yes, it is.
Great. That's good news. Well, anybody else have any updates for this list?
The only other question I have is about Ty Gully. It says sports injury. We probably need to check with Richard, but I'm thinking that's the grandson of those ladies from over around Honeywell. And they come here some, you know,
Right.
and he had some sort of sports injury last fall. I would say he's probably over that.
Sure.
Maybe could be removed.
Okay.
Been on there a long time.
Okay. Well, if you've noticed, this prayer list really isn't all that long. We've had some prayer lists, you know, that went all the way to the bottom, and then we had to make the font smaller, and so it's thankfully within reason right now.
Well, after next month, we're supposed to scrub it anyway,
Yeah.
1st of July, it's
Supposed to be what?
replaced.
Yeah, we're gonna refresh it. You know, have people start over. Because if you don't, then certain names stay on there for all eternity, and nobody knows who they are.
Laura
Yeah.
Skinner, anybody know an update on her? I mean, I think I know who that is, if that's Tom's wife, but she used to work at our office 10 years ago, but I didn't ever hear what her situation was, or if she's even.
I saw him yesterday in the grocery store, but he didn't look happy. And if you know Tom, that's a pretty common thing. So I just stayed clear. So, yeah, yep. I'll have to ask him next time I see him.
You stay clear of me.
Sometimes. I mean, you know, he's a PI. Most PIs are kind of that way. You know, just comes with the job territory. When all you deal with are criminals, you tend to see everybody as criminals. That's just the nature of it. Sometimes I have to remind Kara that this is not a prison.
I sometimes wish you didn't have a good memory.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I have to tell Kara,
Remembers too much.
you're home now, it's not the prison, we're not inmates, we're your family. It's okay, calm down, it's all good. And sometimes I tell the kids to go to their cells, because the warden's home, it's the way it is.
Is
So,
Kara working from home then, Josh? or-
no, she's had to go in every day.
Okay.
And then Luke's been home with me, and I, brought him here some, and I've been homeschooling between 2 and 4 children for a month and a half now. Thankfully, none of us are dead. So the 2 hardest ones are done for the year, which is great. But boy, I am so glad. I'm so looking forward to getting back to whatever normal can be. Phew. Yeah, hopefully. And I'll tell you, I'm still, even though I'm not a school board member anymore, I still get all the newsletters because I decided to keep subscribed to them. They don't know what's going to happen. They have no idea. And anybody who says they know, at best, you're going to have a lucky guess. Nobody knows. Well, cancer list here. Erin Coke can be cleared. She was able to get successful treatment pretty quickly, so that was great. Talked to Brenda today at Summit, and George is doing, I mean, he still has cancer, but he's continuing to way out estimate their predictions for him, so he's doing good. If they can't do classes in the traditional sense, and where they're at in Indiana, internet isn't the best, so they haven't done as much instruction as they would like, but they've got the kids doing independent study, so at least it's something. It's been 2 weeks since I talked to Janet Kelly, but they were doing fine. Anybody have any?
I talked to her this past weekend.
Okay, yeah. And by the way, I want to thank everybody for calling each other. I just, it's so wonderful to be in a church where by the time I get a hold of half you've already talked to one another and everybody's fine, and that's great, you know. And that's just fantastic. Everybody's been taking care of everybody. Let's see. Julius, we haven't heard about Julius in a couple months.
He's, every month he has, and he's doing good. They are sort of advancing him up to a bill, and he's going to be every other month, maybe.
Okay.
I haven't heard from him. It'll be on Tuesday when I hear from him. Maybe, anyway.
He's not sick afterwards.
He's not sick, right?
He's really, really good.
I was gonna say that could increase his quality of life, not having that much poison in you. Yeah.
So anyway, but he said they wanted to maybe go, what was it, 6 months?
Yeah.
And he thought maybe 3, trying 3 first. You know, so I don't know what they're gonna, he didn't know. Is he 78? Yeah, probably.
Jordan Compton, that's Justin Compton's cousin, and he has been diagnosed with liver cancer. And he's only like 40. So that's really unfortunate. So be in prayer for Jordan. Let's see.
You see, Hook,
Yes.
my friend at Macon, they found a spot. It's really, really small, but they're gonna keep monitoring it in the groin from where she had the incision from this last episode, but she's still taking infusions. I think it's like every 3 weeks, I'm not certain on that, but she just got back last weekend from up there, and it's, they couldn't do a biopsy because it was too small, and they were afraid if they went in there to dig around that they might hit something and cause bleeding, and they wouldn't be able to get it stopped. But she needs a lot of heart.
Okay.
Who's that?
Lucy Hook. All right. Talked to Linda Mantle a couple of weeks ago, and not much has changed with Scott's condition, but he hasn't done much worse, so that's something.
Is he taking chemo?
Yeah. Well, anybody else?
Ronald James, continue to pray for him. He still takes treatments. It's kind of, he's doing okay, but yet it's got that Agent Orange.
Oh, yeah.
As a part of it.
Okay, that's rough. That's real rough. All right.
I want to put Mary Moore, our daughter, back on her tumor, brain tumors back.
No, really? What are they thinking with regards to that?
Just hoping it doesn't grow. It was actually back last year when they tested it, but they thought, all the doctors thought it was scar tissue.
Oh,
Well, this year when they looked, they do it once a year, they definitely said it is ground, so it is the tumors. Right now, we just, second surgery usually don't come out too good, so, they're doing nothing right now, but pray.
is she still working?
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That was a big deal last time.
Yeah.
Mm.
But this time it'll be a lot worse,
Yeah.
because there's scar tissue in there, and it makes the retrieving it a lot worse.
Right. Well, we definitely need to be praying for our nation right now. I think if anything, we need to pray for wisdom as much as we do about any virus.
You know, you're talking about this list. There's Leonard Martin. I've never heard. My boy used to see him over in Crossroads. He was born and raised right down the south of me.
Okay.
And I think if nothing else, he could be taken off the list because nobody seems to know nothing. I mean, I don't care, but you just talk about reducing it.
Yeah. Well, hey, Connie. Hey. Welcome, welcome.
There's, you know, nobody seems to know anything about it. I asked, you can't get nowhere. The last time I heard just Stephen said he'd seen him that he was going to Crossroads.
Okay.
I've asked people over there, and they didn't get anywhere.
I don't know. All
I
right.
would like to know how he is.
Sure. Well, does anybody have any updates on our active military list? We haven't done this in a while, so we kind of took our time tonight, but that's okay. It's nice to visit. I'm not aware of anything. I know Ross is okay. Anybody else? No? All right. Well, Alex, would you have a prayer for our list here?
Father, thank you so much for allowing us to be able to come meet here today and be able to be distanced, be safe. Just want to take some time to lift up our prayer requests. We have many people with needs, with cancer, with our nation, our active military. We just want to lift them up to you and let your will be done. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, we actually do have a few announcements, even though there's, negative announcements. First of all, there won't be any youth activities or Sunday school in May. Our Sunday school class in here for the adults is sometimes up to 50 people, and the way we have this spaced out is a maximum of 35, and we don't want to leave anybody out. So we're just going to skip in May, try to do it in June. That's the goal.
Now, is there youth tonight?
No. That's why Alex is here.
Have they put a limit again on how many can be in one building?
No, but they have to keep families 6 feet apart, which ain't going to happen with kids. It just ain't. I mean, you can't even play a game where you can keep kids 6 feet apart. It just doesn't happen.
I understand that.
Yeah. So that's the issue there. So Alex gets to join us tonight. Welcome, Alex. Yeah. We're also asking people to be early Sunday for worship, so we can, escort people one family at a time to a row, and help people not only stay safe but feel safe. If somebody pulls up and they get the feeling that we're not taking things seriously, they may not want to come or may not want to come in, and we don't want that to be how anybody feels. So please be early. The deacons will be ready to escort people into either building. The main service will happen in the FLC, and we'll broadcast it to the original auditorium for people who'd rather be in there or want to stay in a smaller, an area with not as many people. And communion will be served in both places. We have a completely refurbished nursery, if you want to check that out, right down here. And the ladies put the finishing touches on it. Boy, it looks fantastic. So go check that out. We want our people we want our young families to feel like we care about them and their needs. We're going to have graduating student recognition on June 7th, a little later than usual, but school's kind of what it is right now. So if you have a graduate, please let us know so we can recognize them at the service on June 7th. And we're going to do e-gifts. Instead of handing them something physical like a Bible like we normally do, we're going to give them an e-gift to a digital Christian resource. So that's the plan. And of course, everything's online. If you don't have online and you want to watch an old lesson or sermon or service, I'll send you a CD or DVD in the mail. Just let me know. And we're still recruiting for the bus ministry, which we hope to launch in the fall. That is the goal. Anybody else have anything else? Feeling good? All right. Connie, how's that mask feel? That doesn't look comfortable.
It's not particularly. I got some ordered.
Okay. I understand.
This is just what I have.
I get it. All right. Well, let's dive into the Word of God. I am excited to do this with you tonight. Let me tell you something. When you're a preacher and you're used to having feedback, in this classroom, we often have discussions, which I really like. But even if there's not discussion, there's body language, and there's eyeballs looking at you, and there's feedback just that way. Like, occasionally I get a look from the audience like, what does that mean? Or, wow, what did you just say? Or, I really don't like what you just said. Well, at least there's feedback, right? It's different than just talking into a camera. So I can't tell you how strange that's been and how much I'm looking forward to having all of you here. So
It's
thank
really
you.
awkward talking to a camera by yourself.
It is really weird. If you're not used to it, it is very strange. Plus, because here's the deal, right? If you're staring into the camera, you feel like you're talking to yourself. Like that's the feeling you get, And also the way cameras work on computers, you kind of look like you're looking up your own nose, So it's just not that attractive. All right. So anyway, Leviticus. Why in the world am I in Leviticus? Well, I'm going to tell you why. This is maybe the most unappreciated book in the Bible. And also, I think, one of the most underestimated books in the Bible. It's sort of a sleeper. It's a book that has a tremendous amount to tell even the New Testament Christian. Now, of course, the original context of Leviticus was for who? The priest, right? The Levitical priest of the nation of Israel. So you could make the argument, now I think it's a false argument, but you could make the argument this book has nothing to do with us. It's for a priesthood that no longer exists to a nation that no longer exists, at least in its original form. So what does this have to do with us? Well, first of all, I'm going to teach this book from a New Testament perspective. And that should be obvious. But a lot of times, the commentary I see and hear on Leviticus is from a Jewish perspective, which is not useful. Can I just put that out there? It's not useful because we're not Jews, we're not the nation of Israel, and we're not bound to the law. So I'm not going to teach this book from the perspective of a Jewish priest. That would just be an academic exercise. And that's not what this Bible study or this church is about. Instead, we want to bring the sunlight of the New Testament into this book. We want to bring the personage of Jesus into this book. And you're going to see from the very get-go so many parallels. Like it's so obvious. The first chapter alone, you will see how Jesus is involved in this, how we're involved in this, how God the Father is involved in this, and the amazing consistency God has had over thousands of years in bringing us His Word. It's a phenomenal book. One I did not appreciate fully until a few years ago. I've actually written a book on Leviticus. You may have never read it or seen it or heard about it, but it's up there. And it's really a fascinating study. So, to get started, I'm actually going to have us read verses 1 through 4, okay? But we're going to focus on verse 1, all right? But I just want to put it in context for you. So if somebody would, nice and loud so the people over the live stream can hear it too, let's have somebody read Leviticus chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, bring it as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him."
Okay, thank you, Jim. So if you're reading carefully with me, you probably have already seen some parallels. First of all, and then we're going to focus on this tonight in verse 1, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from where? The tent of meeting. Now, in the previous book in Exodus, where had God spoken to Moses from? Do you remember?
The burning bush.
The burning bush, yes, good example. And where else? In the cloud, and also on the mountaintop, right? So we kind of have a progression here. If you go all the way back to Adam and Eve, and after the fall, God no longer walked among men, and it's because man became sinful, and there was separation between man and God. But notice what God has been doing since then. So he's separated from us, but then through his own work, through his grace, he has been getting back to being in close fellowship with man. So, like Linda mentioned, he's in the burning bush, and he's in the cloud, and he's speaking from the sky, and then he's on the mountaintop. But here, where is it? The tent of meeting. He's right there. Now, you would think that we're still 1,500 years until Christ, but this is a foreshadowing of what God is trying to do. He's trying to get back into fellowship with us. But it's going to require what? Sacrifice. So what's the very first thing he starts talking about? Sacrifice. So, go on to verse 2 there. It says, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd of the flock. And then in verse 3 it says, a male without defect. Who's the only male human that ever existed without defect? Jesus. So right there from the beginning, God is painting this picture. He's putting this foreshadowing out there of what's going to be necessary to completely get God and man back together. And he's speaking to Moses from the tent of meeting. So the separation is still there, but it's minimal. That's how much God wants this to work, and how he's come down and reached down to us. We didn't have to go looking for God. We didn't have to perform pagan dances or read tarot cards or learn secret words or anything else that the old pagan religions expected you to be able to do. No, God came down to man. He did it in the beginning, and then even after we broke the covenant, he continued to make that effort and show us how to get there. So I want you to look at the book of Leviticus because from a Christian perspective, it's not useful to look at it as a book for the Levitical priest of the ancient nation of Israel. Look at it as we are the foreshadowed priesthood of the New Testament church. That's what we are, aren't we? We're the royal priesthood of all believers. Every baptized, repentant, obedient Christian is a priest himself unto God. And so this book foreshadows our service unto God. The good news is, in the New Testament, he provides the sacrifice. All we have to do is provide the service. And that first service, for example, is in the waters of baptism. Baptism sure beats a cross. Sure beats a burning sacrifice. So, just fascinating parallels there. Alexander Campbell one time put it, and I think this was really useful. He said, if you go before the law of Moses, what God had told man was like starlight. If, we're out in the country here, and we've actually had quite a bit of time home, and so I've had some time to be out in the yard at night, and there's been some clear nights, and starlight can give you some light. But a full moon can give you a lot more light, but the sun gives you the most light. And so before the law of Moses, you have starlight. In the law of Moses, you have moonlight. And in the New Testament, you have sunlight. But it's the same facts just being progressively revealed over time. God hasn't changed. His expectations haven't changed. In fact, if there's two words you can summarize God's expectations from us since the beginning of time, it would be obey God. And even though some of those specifics have changed, what he generally expects hasn't. And that is he expects a priesthood of obedient service. And not just obedient, but with the right attitude. And I've come to understand this better over time as a parent. If you have a child who obeys you but has a bad attitude, isn't that entirely different than a child who obeys you with a good attitude? It's an entirely different thing. For one, you can trust that child more, because the one with the bad attitude might obey you what? Only to the extent where they would evade punishment. There's no love there, though. There's no desire to make the situation better. They're just trying to do the minimum. Or in a workplace. We've all been with people in workplaces that all they did it for was the paycheck, and all they did was the minimum. There was no love, there was no loyalty, there was no desire to see an improved outcome. Well, that's a big theme in Leviticus that maybe over time we'll be able to get to. depending on how often I sub for Richard. And we might dive into this in Sunday school too, but we'll see, because we're almost done with James, believe it or not. But that's a big part of Leviticus is God he wants us to obey him and sacrifice and in service, but if it's not in love, it doesn't matter. 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, what does it say? You can do any and all things, but if you do it without love, it means nothing. And we all know this. If you have a marriage where you got two people who are faithful to each other for 50, 60, 70 years, but they don't like each other, they don't do anything together, it's just a marriage of duty, how much of a marriage was it? Not much of one. God doesn't just want our service and obedience. He wants our love. Why? Because that's what brings it all together. Now, if you have love without service and obedience, it's an empty love, right? We have a culture right now that has been an experimentation on this for 50 plus years, trying to have love, but also not trying to have faithfulness. And that's not working out at all. In fact, it's hilarious. There was an article I read. Oh boy. I almost feel like I need to print it out and bring it to you sometime. You know, back in the 1960s, America sort of had what was called the sexual revolution. You know, the first time where it became culturally, not morally acceptable, but culturally acceptable for people to do things they hadn't done before. Well, 50 years before that, Russia went through the same thing. But they did it not through, hippie stuff. They did it through state force. The state forced marriages to annul and families to break up and everybody to be treated as individuals. And you were supposed to be able to sleep with whomever you wanted, do whatever you wanted with anybody. The children were going to be owned and taught by the state, and you didn't have to worry about responsibility. Well, guess what happened within like a decade? Murders went up tremendously. Because it turns out that even if you're not married, if you cheat on somebody, guess what they're probably going to do to you if they have the opportunity? Take you out. And you know how many orphans were produced during that time? Hundreds of thousands. And the prison camps filled up overnight with unruly teenagers with no parents. The early communist state figured out real fast that the government was pretty bad at raising kids. And you know what's funny? 100 years later, we still haven't learned our lesson, have we? This is history nobody knows about. And this is an article that was not written recently. It was published in a Russian local newspaper in 1926. So that early on, only 9 years into the revolution, everything had just gone to pots. And it turned out that families were actually a good idea. Imagine that. Imagine that. And it tells all these terrible stories of like this person cheated on this person and then like this family murdered this family. Just absolute total society breakdown and chaos. It makes our virus situation look like a walk in the park. Boy, God knows what he's doing. Man doesn't. All right. Well, if you look at your sheet here, there's some things I want to point out to you. If you look at point 2, Leviticus foreshadows how God will redeem man and how the church will function. There's been a big debate in the theological world, I feel like, for the last 30 to 40 years. And that debate has centered around what was the point of Jesus' sacrifice? Why did he really die? And one theme that keeps coming up, and it's a horrible idea, but it just keeps growing in popularity, and it's this idea that Jesus did not endure our punishment for our sake, but Jesus endured the punishment we intended for God. How bizarre does that sound, right? You almost have to have the idea repeated to you to have any concept of it. But the idea is that, I'll repeat it one more time, it's not that Jesus endured the punishment meant for us, but rather Jesus endured the punishment we meant for God. And why? Because God made this terrible place and made us live in it.
So who come up with this theory?
Oh, it's been around for 30, 40 years now and circulating among denominations and liberal circles, and it's even being taught in certain theological textbooks. And it's not, let's say, broadcast from the hills, because come on, how would the average person receive that? How would the average Christian or church receive that? But it's kind of like Calvinism. It's right below the surface. They don't say it out loud necessarily, but if you know what to look for, you pick up on it. Well, in Colossians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul specifically talks about how we owe a legal debt unto God. And I think maybe the best way to illustrate this is on all of our money. If you look at a dollar bill or anything like that, there's a statement that says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So, for example, if you're at the store and you're going to buy something that costs $1, but right before you hand them that dollar and you own the item, you actually owe them a debt, and you pay it with $1. That's the point. That's the point of tender. That's what it does. Well, Paul describes our sin as a debt owed to God. Why? Because he paid for it. And thank God he did. You know, sometimes I look at the national debt of our country and I think, boy, nobody's going to be able to pay for that. That's absurd. But just imagine our sin debt was even greater than that, because it can't even be put to a number. You can't have a tender large enough to pay that bill. And so Paul puts it in that way so we understand, I think, once and for all, that Jesus' sacrifice was there to pay our debt. That he endured the punishment, or you might say the payment, that we were supposed to pay. So that's the point. I think it's a very poignant illustration that Paul uses there, that we have a legal debt owed unto God that Christ himself has paid. And so what is our role in this? And this is another problem that a lot of modern Christians and Christianity struggles with. There's this idea, and this is how it's often phrased. So if you hear this on the radio, here's a red flag for you. Again, this underground language, you have to know what you're listening for. You can't add anything to the cross of Christ. Okay, true. But what's your point? Because what usually follows is Christ paid the whole price. There's nothing we can do. And if you read in between the lines, if God chose to save you, so be it. If he didn't, oh well. That's what they mean by that. Because if there's a nothing you can do, then that's what that means. That there's nothing you can do. But that is not whatsoever, from the very beginning of time, what priests were expected to do. Can you imagine God telling the Old Testament priests through all these chapters in Leviticus, your job is to do nothing? No. They still had a priestly service to perform. Now, did that priestly service save them? No. They weren't earning God's favor. They were not earning God's sacrifice to come in the form of Jesus Christ, his son. They weren't earning anything. They were obeying him, and in exchange, he was paying the price. That's what we're called to do as priests. So in the New Testament, when I say that part of the plan of salvation is that we need to repent and be baptized and be obedient, I'm not saying any of that earns you anything. No, that's just what God expects so he can give us salvation and grace. That's his terms. I mean, otherwise, Acts chapter 2, when Peter's preaching and the people asked, what shall we do, brethren? Otherwise, Peter wouldn't have said, repent and be baptized. Peter would have said, we'll wait around and see if God chooses you. That's really the logical conclusion of that. But that's not what he says. He says, repent and be baptized. And then a couple of verses later, he says, this promise is for you and all your children. Otherwise, anybody can do this. Anybody can be a priest. It's no longer limited to the nation of Israel or to the priesthood of Leviticus. Or the priesthood of Levi. It is limited to nobody except the only exception is that you must obey. And the good news is anybody can do that if they so choose. So, I bring this up because for 500 years in particular in Christianity, there continues to be this very bad misunderstanding of what obedience is. Obedience, of course, is not about earning anything. And again, let me bring this back to the illustration with my children. For a long time now, I'm a hardcore believer in capitalism, so forgive me for that one, all right? In today's culture, you have to almost apologize for that. But I've always made my kids earn what they wanted from the very beginning. And to this day, that's true. And then as they get older, I actually pay for less and less, and I make them work for it and pay more and more. And why is that? Because it turns out when they have some skin in the game, they care. If I knew that God had given me salvation and I had no choice in the matter, I couldn't get in or out of it if I wanted to, and no matter what I did, I was going to heaven, I can tell you right now what that incentivizes my flesh to do. Whatever I wanted. And I say that because before I was a Christian, that's exactly what I did. I lived by the flesh and I did whatever I wanted. It almost ended in destruction. Now,
Sounds like you don't have a conscience.
right. When it comes to, well, I'll be honest with you. Before I was a Christian, the only reason I really did good was to avoid conflict. I mean, what else is there? Why would I do good other than some benefit for me outside of Christ? Like, your only reasons for doing good outside of your relationship with God is for some selfish reason, something that serves me. But suddenly when I have a relationship with God, there's a grander scheme, and there's more players in the act, and there's a lot more consequence involved. And I realized how much my life and my example mattered. But outside of God, a person may have morality outside of God, but they don't have a reason for it. They don't have a foundation for it. A preacher put it to me real well one time. Can an atheist be moral? Sure. You can also build a house on sand. And for a little while it'll stand. But when the storms come, when death approaches, it's the foundation that holds you up. And that's what it is. And so it's just so important that we understand God requires obedience for our sake. He already paid the price. He's done his part with Jesus. We obey because that is what appropriates his gift to us. All right. Hey, Jeffrey. All right. I know how much you've missed my preaching.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. 2 months, right? Well, we got a couple of minutes left, and I just monologued forever, which I don't like to do. Anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts? I hope you can see the worth in this. I'm a big fan of Leviticus. The more I study it, the more I find it fascinating. How close God is to the people. The parallels he draws for us. Let me point out one other thing for you before we quit. Go to the end of verse 9. The end of verse 9 talks about the priest putting the offering on the altar, okay, and it's burning. And it says, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Then go to the end of verse 13. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Go to verse 17 at the end. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. The book of Leviticus talks more about how to make God happy, how to please God more than any other book. There's more language in the book of Leviticus about how to bring joy to the heart of God. And how do we do that? Through obedience and love. And again, going back to my kids. When my kids obey and they do it with a good attitude, it's a whole other kind of relationship than if obedience or love isn't a part of it. And that's all he desires from us. And if we do that, he does all that really matters in the end, which is take care of the problem of sin and death. So, we'll see if Richard needs another sub next week. He had a hangar accident with the windstorm the other day, so he's occupied at the moment. So I'll step in during the summer as needed. But if you're interested in more, I've got a book on Leviticus upstairs, and we'll come back to it if there's demand, and or we finish James and people want to study it. So that's the plan.
Was there other problems with the wind around damage around here.
That's the only one I heard about.
Just a little bit molded.
Okay.
Was it? I didn't
That's
know.
what I heard about it.
It must have been during the night.
Well, you know, Moberly, there's a lot of flat
3
plains.
o'clock in the afternoon, I was there.
Yeah.
And the bid is that over by Love, that building, that they go them off.
Oh, wow, yeah. So, thankfully, I don't think anybody was hurt, just some wind damage. All right, well, thanks again for joining me. It was fantastic to have all of you here and to see your faces and get feedback, at least through your expressions. And Alex will tell you, it's no fun to stare at yourself in a camera. So, I'm grateful to be back. All right. Well, Jim Willis, would you close us in prayer?
Lord, I think it's time we gather together, Lord, this third Lord, we work, we need to take it to heart, do it for you in this community, Lord. We ask that you be part, Lord, to keep us in safety and bring us back Sunday. Give us and guide, direct us, forgive us for our fails, and these do you pray for thanks.
Amen. All right. Thank you all.
The cows got through on the west side and got back into.
Bye, Connie.
Field. And they made a track through over to the waterfowl.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you Sunday, all right? Be early. See you later.